Paul's going to take a lot of the time today to kind of comprehensively walk through developing an effective sports ministry. I just want to cast a little bit of vision and talk a little bit for a couple minutes here about strategic importance of sports ministry. I grew up in a state in the United States called Ohio, which is in the Midwest area, more towards the north, and grew up not with any type of religious background per se. My dad grew up without knowing his father, and really found community and identity and purpose and mentoring, not in the church, but found it in the sports world and in community, in the sports community. So growing up, sports were the most important thing in my life. I can say I pretty much had almost no religious background. Religion did not play, church did not play any significant role in my life. And I just want to paint a picture for just a second and then just talk a couple things about some strategic importances of sports ministry, just so we can kind of be all on the same page here. So I grew up in a town of about 50,000 people, which was right outside of a major city of about 300,000 people. And the elementary school that I went to, so when I gave my life to Christ at age 23, I remember thinking back on growing up, and one of the things that stuck with me was I couldn't remember really anybody reaching out to me or to my peers from the entire time that I was about 6 years old till I was 18 and graduated high school. Now, that's interesting because the elementary school that I went to, Lincoln Elementary in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, had about 500 students in it, and right across the street from our elementary school was a church. And I literally cannot remember any event ever taking place at that church. I don't remember anything ever going on. I walked by that school or that church on my way to school every day for 4 years. 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. I don't remember any outreach. I don't remember anybody engaging us with the gospel. So my memory is of this church that sat across from our school with no memory of anything ever going on. No carnival, no cars in the parking lot. It was an active church, but nothing going on. Now, right across from the baseball fields where I played baseball was another church. And I could not remember. So thousands of kids would participate in baseball at our baseball complex in our city. There was a church right across the street. I never remember any activity, any outreach, anything that would have engaged us with the gospel. Yet thousands of young people and families right across the street from them. Then when I got to be about 14 years of age, I started playing basketball seriously. And there was one park in our city where everybody went to play, and it was Lions Park. I mean, hundreds of professional, college, amateur type players. And again, right across the street from it was a church that was known as being a global world outreach center. They literally broadcast their services worldwide. Yet, I drove by there every day in the summer, and they had no outreach ever to engage our community. There was not one thing that I ever saw that compelled me to go inside that building or to be engaged with anything that they had. So my experience, when I came to Christ at 23, I look back and I'm like, wow, from 6 to 18, I can't remember any church or any organization intentionally reaching out to the thousands of peers that I had who were in the sports community. Now, let me just say this. There's a good quote. Rick Rusall, who wrote a book in the United States called The Externally Focused Church, he asks a question in that book. He says, if your church or your organization disappeared from your community, would they even know it, and would they even care? And he asked that question. Would your community even know if you disappeared? Ed Stetzer, who wrote a book as well called Breaking the Missional Code, and he talks about that to have any effective outreach strategy as a church or as an organization, you really need to understand that there are geographic regions, there's population segments, and there's cultural environments. And this is where people are in your community. And you have to know where people are, and you have to know how to build bridges to them, and you have to know how to engage them if you're going to be effective as a church in mission. Here's our key statement for today that Paul's going to build around. And this is a personal conviction that I have. I really believe that the sports community is one of the most strategic mission fields for the church, and that every church or organization who takes mission seriously should have a strategy to engage those in the sports community and should have a strategy to use sports to engage the lost. I firmly believe that. Let me tell you why I think sports ministry is strategic from my perspective. Number one, it reaches young people. 75% of those people who come to Christ do so before the age of 18. 90% of people who come to Christ do so before the age of 25. Okay? In our city, in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is the amateur sports capital of the world, supposedly, there are hundreds of thousands of young people who are engaged in sports. So for us to be relevant, we need to be able to be where they are and have proximity if we're going to influence them. And we need to also have something that we're offering that will engage them. That's where they are, okay? So it reaches young people. Two, it reaches leaders. That I really believe one of the most untapped areas for leadership for the kingdom is in the sports world. Okay? The gift of leadership many times is you'll find it in the sports world. So for me, here I was as a 22-year-old, I was a leader. I was a leader in my high school, I was a leader on my college campus, but nobody had ever tapped me for a bigger vision for my life of leadership and influence and using my platform for the glory of God. And all over the athletic world, there are leaders waiting to be apprehended for the purposes of God. Okay, so it reaches leaders. Three, it reaches campuses. Okay, the largest population of young people are on campuses. In the United States, they have to be there 190 days a year for 8 or 9 hours. They're sitting there, okay? And most of the future leaders of society come off of campuses. So what are we going to do as a church to intentionally engage them? 4, it reaches culture. Okay? There's a recent study that I saw. There's a radio program in the United States called Sports Spectrum, and they had done all this research with all these media outlets to find out what engages people in culture. And they found out that almost 2-to-1 that people listen to athletes, sportsmen, and coaches for the issues of life more than they do any other source. Specifically, pastors and clergy. They were way higher in what the average person would look to for credibility on the issues of life. Okay? The study of sport and society at Northeastern University did a study about 20 years ago. They found the same thing. They found that the number one voice that people listen to in culture was not politicians, it was not clergy, it was athletes and entertainers. That was the cultural capital, so to speak. Fifth, it reaches men. Sports ministry reaches men. There's an epidemic of a lack of men in the church, both in the United States and globally. And then last, it reaches influencers. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book, The Tipping Point, talks a lot about how cultural change happens. And you have to understand the dynamics of cultural change. Let me give you a couple examples. A friend of mine, Darrell Green, who is a Hall of Fame American football player in the United States, was won to Christ in his rookie year by a guy who was not an athlete, but who understood the importance of reaching athletes and reaching the athletic context. And Darrell Green played 20 years. He won 3 Super Bowls, was in the Pro Bowl, is now in the Hall of Fame in the U.S. But in that time, he won 78 of his teammates to Christ. And now sits in a position of unbelievable influence in the community of Washington, D.C. So much so that several presidents have given him platform to be able to speak into issues of young people and education. Okay, another friend of mine, Mark Brunell, who's an American quarterback, football quarterback, who's since retired, started a Bible study in his home. Within about a month, 10 of his teammates had come to Christ. They planted a church in that city that's now a 3,000-member church out of a Bible study. And they have influence in that culture. Okay, so I could go on and on and on. Another friend of mine, last one I'll talk about, we were doing an outreach in Lima, Peru several years ago, and we were in a village called Tarapoto, and we were doing this outreach, and one of the guys that got reached ended up being the strongest man of South America. He wouldn't look like it. His name's Pepe, Jose Salim. And he came to Christ as we were doing our outreaches. We came back a year later, and he had 50 men that he was discipling because he had a gym. And he opened up his gym, and he said, you can have free membership here, but you have to do Bible study when you come. Okay? Now, the Institute of Sport for the entire nation of Peru has given him the responsibility and access of coming in and helping to push down his values into all of sport for the nation of Peru. So it helps reach influencers and those who influence culture. So I wanted to paint a picture for you of what my situation looked like, and many times what the church is like. Many times our churches don't understand the mission fields that are right around us. Okay, and how we can build strategic bridges for that. Okay, I'm going to have Paul come up and take it from here.
How many of you guys are, all of you guys, are you guys, anybody here in full-time ministry? Okay, a lot of you guys. How many of you guys have prayed for revival? You heard Dave mention the word revival earlier. How many of you guys pray for revival? Looks like every one of us does. I think Dave and I are fortunate enough to be in a large church where we're seeing revival take place through our church, in our church. And we're praying for, and we're planning and strategically planning for ways to influence our culture and our community through our church as well. But I know in an isolated and a declining church world in Europe, and it's declining in America also, we're lucky to be in one of America's fastest growing churches. Revival is a common prayer request that we all share and we all pray for and yearn for. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about 2 sports ministry models that have played a significant role in a church, a local church, and a church movement, okay? Today's theme is, as you see, the vision and strategy for building a successful sports ministry. And before we dive into that, I just want to say a quick prayer. You guys, I have a similar background to Dave. Dave's an ex-professional basketball player. I brag about him all the time. I've already told half you guys, but Dave has played in the NBA against guys like Michael Jordan and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. But what I love about Dave the most is just his passion and his commitment to the church and to the lost and people that need the gospel. He's a dynamic church leader and my boss, and I love working with Dave. So I'm not just saying that for brownie points. You guys, I grew up, I'm going to share a little bit, just very briefly, how I came to Sweden. And then we're going to merge into a Swedish model of sports ministry. And we're going to look at an American model of sports ministry as well. All right. I grew up in what we in the hockey world refer to as Hockey Town. And you Swedish people might know of some of the Swedes that play on the Detroit Red Wings. But I grew up following the Red Wings. And hockey was my sport. I'm not going to go deeply into my testimony, but my motivation to play hockey, because of the pressure I felt growing up as a kid through my dad who loved me, but he put a lot of pressure on me, coaches, to live up to fans' expectations, was a fear of failing. So my motivation to play was a fear of failing. And you can never, my coach used to always say, you can never win a game by being afraid to lose it. So you can never be your best as an athlete or in anything in life out of a fear of failing. And so as time went on, I had a couple of very difficult, I had a great hockey career growing up as a kid, but I had a devastating experience, which became the best experience because that's when I met Christ. I was playing at the University of Michigan, college hockey, and I was asked to try out for the Olympic team in 1982 after America won the Miracle on Ice, you guys might remember. And so it was a joy to be asked to try out, but I put a lot of pressure on myself to succeed. I came down with a sickness called mononucleosis. It's a tiredness sickness, which kind of surfaced afterwards. I didn't know I had it, but no excuse. I just didn't play well. I put a lot of pressure on myself. I read about other athletes that would be there, guys like Brett Hall and Chris Chelios and many superstars, and I compared myself with them, and I had a complex. I didn't play well. I came home, heard my parents were going through a divorce, which was devastating. My younger brother, not too long after that, was hit by a drunk driver, survived, but it made me think a lot about life. And all of a sudden, because my identity was in sports so much, I began questioning life when sports didn't go well for me. And because my self-value and my self-worth fluctuated, it went up and down with my performance as an athlete. Because hockey was my God, basically. It was what I poured my heart into the most. I believed in God, but I poured my heart into sports more than I did in God at the time. And I didn't know the Lord personally at the time. An athlete saw at the University of Michigan that I was hurting inside. And he, and this is key for today's discussion, he invited me to a Bible study at the University of Michigan with athletes that did notice the opportunities to reach people with the gospel. And they put their arms around me. They asked me to go to a Bible study. They saw I was hurting. They prayed for me. They introduced me to the Bible. And I became a Christian. And my life literally turned upside down. I mean, for the good. It turned right side up, I should say. The verse, Colossians 3:23, that basically talks about, everything we do, we should do it 100% for God and not for man, because man will disappoint us. Your coaches will disappoint you. Your teachers will disappoint you. Your parents, even though they love you, will disappoint you. And you'll disappoint yourself. But when we make God our first and only audience, it takes all the pressure off of you of having to live up to other people's expectations. And it freed me from the pressure of living up to other people. And it gave me a self-confidence that I'd never had prior to that, because I knew that he was happy with me no matter how well I did it, as long as I was playing for him. Make a long story short, I played professionally in the New Jersey Devils organization for a couple of years. And then I had the opportunity to travel on a missions trip to Sweden, Russia, and Finland, and to use hockey as a tool to reach out with the gospel. I had never heard of a hockey missions trip before. I had heard of Athletes in Action and the FCA Bible team or basketball teams that share the gospel. But I had stopped playing. I missed hockey. Wasn't content selling Pampers and Pringles with Procter & Gamble, even though it's a great company, and felt that God still had something left for me with regards to hockey. I actually had a dream that I saw myself standing in Europe playing hockey a week later. And then I received an invitation from a hockey player, the only other Christian in the New Jersey Devils organization, that told me about a Christian team that was traveling to Europe for 3 weeks to play and share their faith. And I thought, I need a kick. I became a Christian at the University of Michigan through the Bible study, but I didn't have anybody mentoring me. There was no Athletes in Action that had found me. There was no church that had found me and mentored me and discipled me. And so I decided I needed a kick in the butt, and I went on this trip. And I saw 1,500 people receive the gospel through 3 hockey games in Russia, Sweden, and Finland. And it just opened my eyes to how the gospel could be spread through sports, and it changed my life. And I saw how God had given me a tool to use for Him. And there's actually a verse in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20 you might want to write down. And if you guys, I was wondering whether or not it was time for me to leave hockey, because my last year playing professionally, or my first training camp, I should say, I walked into my first training camp and I saw guys drinking at night while they're going to be trying out to make a professional team the next morning. I saw guys sleeping with other women, even though they had family at home. There was talk about steroid abuse during that time. And I had just learned that when you become a Christian, your body is supposed to be a temple. And you're supposed to fill your body with good things. Yet I was now in an unclean environment. And we're going to get back to that word, quote unquote, unclean environment, where I saw for the first time 17 fights in my first game. I played tough as a hockey player. I mean, sometimes as a hockey player, you have to defend yourself. And then you see the alcohol, you see the unfaithfulness, you see the steroid abuse in sports. You see 75% of the NFL who are suicidal, drunk, or divorced when their seasons are over. You see a need in the sports world. And here I was thinking, I've been dreaming about playing here my whole life. And now I'm here and it doesn't feel right. What's missing? And so 1 Corinthians 7 verse 20 says basically that normally you should remain who you are when you are called. And that's a verse that the only other Christian in the New Jersey Devils, who ironically we roomed together for 3 weeks during the training camp, shared with me. And all of a sudden I started realizing that God could use my sport for Him. But I was not being mentored. And so I stopped playing after a while, kind of fumbled through life, not really knowing what God wanted me to do, when I had a chance to go on this missions trip where I saw 1,500 people make decisions for Christ, and it was awesome. When I came to Sweden, I was approached by a professional hockey player's father. His name is Marcus Naslund, the player. Played for many, many years. Leonard knows him. And played in the NHL for 15 years, a superstar. Had his jersey retired with the Vancouver Canucks recently. Finished his career with the New York Rangers. His father invited me to come to Sweden because he told me that there was a gap between church and sport. He said there was a wall between the two, and that he felt, and other pastors that he invited to meet me and they prayed for me, they felt that God was calling me to come there to help build a bridge between church and sport. And all I was there for was to play hockey, share my faith, and grow, because I was a young Christian that felt like I didn't have much confidence theologically. I was just on an adventure, sharing my faith and playing hockey. And when I came to Sweden, I had just become a Christian. I had no biblical schooling. I had no theological training. My prayer was that God would increase my faith like He did in Elijah's walk, and that He would use me to help expand His territory as Jabez, His territory, as we read about in the prayer of Jabez. And that God would call me to start a sports ministry, since sport and church did not coincide. I felt like maybe God could use me to help build a bridge between the two that way, and show the church movement that it could be that we should embrace sports as a missions field and not look at it as an unclean folk group, which we're going to look at a little closer. More importantly, that God would expand His territory through sports ministry, that He would help me penetrate the secularism and the isolated church world that I was becoming very familiar with in Sweden. So one day I was just getting into my Bible, and I was reading the book of Nehemiah. And the Lord showed me a model in which Nehemiah used to build the walls around Jerusalem. And from that model, I've kind of followed 4 simple steps. And again, remember, I had no church background. I had just become a Christian. I didn't even know hardly the difference between the New and the Old Testament. And yet here I was in Sweden sharing my faith and seeing doors open around me in just a very supernatural way. But I've decided to follow in a very symptomatic way, because my mind was very simple with regards to Christianity at that time. I built a little bit of a model. It began by the compassion I felt for lost teammates. Okay, that's what motivated me, and the burden that I felt for the falling walls of the declining, isolated church in Sweden. And there's a lot of parallels to the book of Nehemiah. So that's the vision and the strategy. So we're going to look at Nehemiah, okay, and doing that. I'd like to take a quick look at the current state of a declining church movement in Europe before we go further. If you're not aware, my prayer is that you'll also be burdened by these statistics. I almost said statistique, Leonard. Check out the following two sets of statistics. We're going to look at this one and one more. This was a Gallup poll taken in 2008, okay? The question was, in the Gallup poll, does religion occupy an important place in your life? And this is the percentage of people in these countries that said no. You can see them. I don't have to read through all of them, but Estonia, 84%, Sweden, 83%. I think this was taken in 2008, correct? Denmark, Norway, some of the Scandinavian countries. And our church has a focus on Europe and Scandinavia, both Eastern and Western Europe, because we see the need for the gospel in these areas. And my heart beats obviously for Sweden because I've been there for so long. Let's take another look. This is an older stat taken by I received by a pastor in England named Colin Dye, who spoke in my church in Sweden probably 10 years ago, but these have increased and intensified since then. So 500 million Europeans have never opened a Bible, and that's according to the magazine Corset Sierra from Germany, I believe. Only 32% of Europeans believe in God, and those are fans and not necessarily followers. Okay. 22 countries have less than 1% evangelical Christians on average, and close to 300 people groups need to be reached with the gospel. Okay, I don't know about you, but that's pretty scary. And it feels like our country, America, who was built on a Christian infrastructure, is becoming more and more secular also. And I really believe that God is calling some of its own missionaries back to America and to help us in the state that we're at right now, with regards to trying to reestablish some of the Christian foundations that we built through our universities, through our hospitals, through our charities, and so forth. The church's mindset towards sports. We're going to read a little bit here. Do you guys have your Bibles with you by any chance? Maybe I can have a designated reader also. We're going to look a little bit here from the book of Acts, because there's a strong similarity between the way the country of Sweden and other European countries have viewed sports from the church. And I think Acts paints a really close picture to what I think the mindset of the church was before, even though it's changed now more. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 28 and 29 a little bit. But some of the things that the church used as reasons to avoid sports were violence in sports, the sex scandals that you see in sports, the steroid abuse you see in sports, competing on Sundays, even though there's a lot of support for what Jesus did on the Sabbath. There's really 3 exceptions to working on the Sabbath, out of necessity, out of mercy, and out of service. If we read in Matthew 12, 3 through 12, Jesus gives us 3 kind of exceptions to the rule of serving him on Sundays. But when we read in Acts, we read about this unclean picture. So if we go back to the Bible here, when Peter receives a vision, he's sitting on a roof and he receives this vision to share the gospel with the Gentiles. And in verse 11, Peter is speaking to Cornelius, who's an Italian centurion, and he says, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or visit him." Okay? So they weren't allowed to associate with an unclean people group. Up until that point, the Jews were not to associate with the unclean Gentiles. And this is the way the Swedish church movement, I felt, has acted in large part towards the sports movement growing up. They just avoided it. They saw these problems and they didn't feel that it was right for people to participate in them instead of going to that world and trying to help it. Instead of seeing sport as a missions field, one that we need to reach, they saw it as an unclean people group and one that we should avoid. However, as we continue to read this text, Peter concludes by saying, "God has shown me, however, that I should not call any man impure or unclean." So early in this context, Peter is sitting on this roof when he receives this vision from God to not avoid the unclean Gentiles, but to go to them with the gospel, which was one of the rapid ways the gospel began to spread. So the vision he received was to go to this quote-unquote unclean people group instead of avoiding it. And that's how the gospel began to spread. So this is also what motivates me that helped me begin my ministry and how God used me to help build a bridge between the church movement and the sports world. So I spent years traveling. I started traveling to churches throughout the country and in order to try to change their mindset. And God was doing some unique things through my hockey playing. God was opening up the media. I never looked for it. But hockey was going well, and the media followed that. And what is this unique concept of the hockey playing sport evangelist in Örnsköldsvik my first 2 years in northern Sweden? And then I moved down south and went to a Bible school a year, and I worked as a talent scout with the NHL. But then I was hired uniquely by a church in a town called Skillingaryd, which I will get into pretty quickly. But before I do that, I want to now look at the church's mindset towards sports ministry, and there's a difference. We first talked about the church's mindset towards sports. Now we're going to look at the church's mindset towards sports ministry just for a second. Very legalistic. I know a pastor, and his name was Torbjörn Sedin, and he was a pastor in northern Sweden that basically was looked down upon by the Pentecostal movement because he was associating with the sports club in a town called Jokkmokk. They didn't understand why he would be a pastor and associate with this unclean people group at the same time. And because of that, he received a lot of negative critique, and it actually burnt him out. He's a passionate, energetic, faithful servant of God, and it burnt him out to the point of a nervous breakdown. I was barely hired as Sweden's first church-based sports pastor. After I finished Bible school, a guy named Leif Svensson that Leonard and I spoke about yesterday, who died on the boat Estonia when the boat sank with many Swedes on it, another story. But when I finished Bible school, Leif was sending out letters to the whole church movement in Sweden. Hey, we've got this hockey-playing evangelist that wants to serve the gospel, can help you build a bridge. Not one church in Sweden showed any interest except for one in a town that I could not pronounce the name. It looked like Skillingaryd on paper, but now I can at least say Skillingaryd. Is that close, Leonard? Okay. And so it was a 51-49 vote by the elders to bring me in. It was a very, very close vote. And then there was times later on during that time before the big change took place where I could actually stand up behind the pulpit and share about a person who became a Christian through some of our sport outreach programs, and not one person would share any kind of enthusiasm. That was early on when I first came. Not one person would show any enthusiasm, partially because you don't want to stick out as a Swede, but especially with the issue of church and sport, it was a very sensitive still issue, so much that it would cloud and contaminate a person's joy, that we couldn't express joy for a newly saved person, okay? That leads me to wanting to share a little bit about what I believe hinders to a church experiencing revival in our church movement. I can also share a story. I think I'll save that, but as we move forward, there was actually, before I get into this, I want to share a little article that I read, and it has to do with revival, okay? And it says this. It says, and I think it's written by a guy named Mikael Torstensson in Sweden from many years ago. And it contextualizes his feeling, the frustration of a lack of of revival in Sweden. It says this: a phenomenon that is common among Swedish Christians is when one prays that God shall send revival in a way that would indicate that God is unwilling to send one. God has had revival for 2,000 years. The problem is not God. The problem is we Christians that want to channel revival. And then in the book of 2 Chronicles 16:9, it says, "For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him." So when can we expect a revival? When longing after revival grows larger than everything else in life. When longing to see people be saved wins over the fear of witnessing. When people's salvation becomes more important than tradition and arguing over worship style or ministry policy. When the word becomes more important than tradition and receives more time than TV and ungodly websites and television programs and magazines. When prayer is transformed from a ritualistic ritual to a desperate desire to see people come to faith. When gossip and cheating on taxes, slander, and egoism are confessed as sin and we turn away from such things. Don't just pray for revival, be a channel for revival. I don't know how you guys feel, but it gives me goosebumps and brings tears up to my eyes every time I read that, because it makes me point my finger at me and ask me where I am in my own walk and how I'm making myself available to be a channel for revival. So we're going to talk a little bit about what hinders revival, okay? What hinders there are to revival. And I've got three mentioned here. The first one I just kind of shared, Christians that get in the way of revival. And what do I mean by that? Let's read Acts chapter 11, verse 2-3. It says, when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers criticized him and said, you went into the house of uncircumcised men and ate with them. It's unbelievable to me that Jesus would be criticized by his own disciples and his own brothers for wanting to be with unbelievers. Those were his own brothers and colleagues, and disciples, okay? How often do we do that? We waste precious time arguing what worship style we'll use, what church our neighbor goes to, what tendencies that person has when he's not in church, he or she. While athletes in our context are literally dying. People are dying under our noses spiritually, and we're worried about what he or she does in their free time and what kind of church politics are taking place, that we miss seeing the sheep that Jesus talks about in Luke. Okay? This leads me to my second point. Unclear goals. All right? Just think about how much more productive we Christians would be if the world was more focused and enthusiastic to win and change the world. Some of the world's greatest accomplishments have been achieved by individual people with motivating speeches and heart-capturing speeches. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. All right. Then we have actually an alumni from my university, Neil Armstrong. He says this: we choose to go and walk on the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's difficult. So the Americans had somewhat been passed by some of the Russian space technology, and they felt that they wanted to keep up during I believe it was the 1960s, early in the 1960s. So they sat down and they wrote the NASA program, and the government wrote planned, detailed strategies as how they would put a man on the moon by the end of that decade. And we all know what happened. Little step for man and a great step for mankind. Just within 10 years, they put a man on the moon. It amazes me what we can do when we really put our minds to something, all right? That leads me to the third point. And I could talk deeper into these, but for the sake of time. And I really feel that this is one of the largest hinders to revival in the church movement in Europe. And even in America, in the world. Playing on the home field. What do I mean by that? I think one of the problems is that many Christians play on their home field. The toughest thing to do as an ex-professional hockey player or ex-professional basketball player, I think Dave would agree, would be going to an away game with 25,000 people in the audience, and you walk into the ice from the locker room where people are throwing things at you, they're swearing at you, they're spitting at you, depending on where you're playing, what city, and playing with the same kind of courage on the away ice or the away field, the away rink, as you would on your home field advantage. At your home field. We had recently a hockey game between the University of Michigan and Michigan State University with 115,000 people at the University of Michigan football field, and I wouldn't want to have been Michigan State's one of their members walking into the big house at the University of Michigan with probably 80,000 of those people being Michigan fans. That's pretty intimidating when you play on the away ice or the away basketball court at times. And if you ask your coach what he thinks probably is what he respects about his players the most, it would be a player that we have this term called a practice player. He's really good in practice, but he doesn't show up in the games. There's also a player that shows up on his home rink but never shows up on the away rink. And a coach will tell you the player that he appreciates the most is a player that shows up with the same courage on the away field as he does on the home field. Sounds kind of like some of us, Christians as well. Feels so good to be at home that we never want to leave our secure environment and leave our walls and put ourselves in uncomfortable places in schools or businesses or communities where we know that we'll stick out because we don't look at things the same way they do through maybe a political correctness kind of way. Jesus had very few home games. Very few home games. He was always on the away field. Always on the away field. He went from house to house. He went from town to town. And he spread the gospel. And he sees Zacchaeus up in a tree. He says, Zacchaeus, come down. Today I'm going to guest your house. Away victory in the home of the embezzler. Jesus has a phenomenal ability to win people in their own environment. And that's what we're talking about here. So let's move to some of the keys to revival. Okay, what are some keys to building bridges to the community, specifically through sports? There's 4 points I have here. The first one is a new way of associating with people. Jesus, as I just mentioned, he ate with the tax collector. Not on the home field, but on the away field. As I mentioned, he sees Zacchaeus and he goes to his house, and he wins the embezzler in his own home. I can guarantee you, because I tried this, that if we as a church send out a random invitation to our hockey team to your church service, they're not going to come, unfortunately. Especially in church services where the message today can become so confusing because of the desensitization that's taking place from the pulpit in many churches around the world today. There's a lot of things that compete with the Christian message today. But a new way of associating with people. I spent every game that I played in Sweden, after each game, and public speaking was my largest fear growing up. I didn't like speaking in front of people. And especially when you move to a foreign country and butcher the language your first couple of years, and you're sharing the gospel with that language to a foreign people group, especially in their locker room, because I made myself write my testimony down on a piece of paper. I put it in a New Testament, and I walked in the game. After every game, I walked in the locker room against each opposing team, and I gave a 5-minute testimony. I passed out New Testaments. I would speak with the coach before the game and ask if I could, and only one team in the 20 years that I lived in Sweden ever said no. And talk about being pulled out of your comfort zone. But that's, I think, what we're talking about here, a new way of associating with people in their own environment, all right? Secondly, a new way of prioritizing. There's 2 Bible verses we can look at. Luke 15, verse 5, Jesus says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." Okay? And in Luke 15:8, the woman who has 10 silver coins and she loses one, and she lights a lamp and she sweeps the floor looking desperately for this coin, and she couldn't wait to tell her neighbors. And it's a kind of that enthusiasm and that passion and compassion, which is one of the words that's used most in the New Testament by Jesus himself for the lost people in our communities that Jesus wants us to have for the lost. Okay, that's what we're talking about with a new way of prioritizing. Jesus says in Luke 15 that that all the angels in heaven will rejoice over one sinner that has repented and come to Christ. That one lost sheep in that lost coin. The third point here, a willingness to pay the price to reach the unreached. Many of us have raised our hands, including myself, when I ask the question, how many of us long for revival and believe in revival? The truth is that it costs. It costs something, and some of us are not willing to pay it. And I had to ask myself that question before, Paul, are you willing to pay the price? And I'm confronted with that question every day of my life, in ministry or in my private life. It doesn't go away. I prayed a very dangerous prayer before I came back from Europe to America. I prayed that God would not let me remain or become comfortable. After 20 years of pioneering the sports ministry work and rallying churches and different denominations and helping them build up sports ministries and developing camps and leading people to Christ and that sort of thing, I felt finally I got to a point where I could breathe, and God blessed me with a beautiful home and a position in Sweden, a platform to share the gospel, and I loved it. And that's what scared me. I loved it because I was starting to feel so comfortable. I felt like I hit a roof in my development as a Christian, and I felt like, God, don't let me become complacent or comfortable. And God answered that question, that prayer, by bringing me to Indianapolis. Very similar to when Elijah prayed that it wouldn't rain, and then he defeats King Ahab on Mount Carmel and the prophets of Baal, but then he comes back and he finds his river where God fed him had dried up. And he goes and hides in a cave and asks God, how do you forget me? Why is my river dried up? And God says, I didn't forget you, Elijah. You're the one that prayed it wouldn't rain. So God basically answered Elijah's prayer. And he wasn't discontent with Elijah's life. He was very pleased with Elijah's life. But I felt I can relate to that, because when I came home to America after 20 years without seeing my family very much, on my way back to America on my way to the airport, I stopped at the Stockholm Open to work, where I had a chance to share with Andre Agassi just a year before. And I was going to do my last service as a Swedish missionary before coming home. My car was packed. I was at the Stockholm Open in a guarded parking lot. My fear was I should take in my computer with my backup and articles and pictures from 20 years that mean a lot to me. And my colleague, Andreas, says, Paul, don't worry, God will protect it. That's his exact words. We go in, I came back, everything was gone from my car. 20 years of the most important things that I valued were gone. My car was broken into. God has a sense of humor. Maybe God was trying to help me let go of things that I was holding on to so dear, to free me to take a new step. Okay, as soon as I get home, my mom died. She had a heart attack. And I hadn't seen her hardly for 20 years, maybe once a year, and she's my mother. And she was so happy that I was coming home. And I met her once when I was just moving back, but I hadn't moved yet. I was still moving my things back, and thankfully she met my wife-to-be one time before she died. But she died my first day of work, and that was hard. We lose family members every day, but just the fact that she was so joyous, and I hadn't seen her for so long, and I couldn't wait to see her, it was hard. There is something called a reverse culture shock as a missionary too. Even if you're coming back to a modern country like America, I experienced the change and transition of coming back to America as well. And there are a lot of things that I went through. But despite all these questions and despite all these changes, and I can't honestly say that I've enjoyed this transition totally. It's been letting go of something dear to me, inheriting something new that stretched me, but that was my prayer. And I know I'm exactly where God wants me to be, and I've never learned as much and grown as much, and I don't want to be anywhere else. And that He answered my prayer, and that He's stretching me, and He does that with all of us. So a willingness to pay the price to be available to reach the lost. It costs something. And my question is, are you and I willing to pay that price to reach our sports communities, for example, for Christ? If I had not said yes to that, I would have missed coming back to America. I would have missed my wife and my 15-month-old baby. Had I said no during probably 100 times during my 20 years in Sweden, I would have missed seeing thousands of kids come to Christ. I would have missed seeing churches building bridges to the community through sports and absorbing the sports communities with what we call ethics and morals in sports, biblical principles in the sports world, and seeing how athletes were starting to come to faith and grow, and how first-generation kids who became Christians at our sports camps, hundreds of kids through the years, are now, they were 10 years old then, they're 20 and 30 years old now, in leadership positions in schools and churches and sports clubs and organizations, planting Christian values in their surroundings and in their atmosphere. It's amazing. So what could you be missing by saying no to your adventure, by an unwillingness to pay that price that costs us to maybe let go of things that are hindering us from experiencing more in our Christian walk? It's a question I ask myself, and I'm challenging you with today as well. The next point, a cleansing and an unloading, and then we're going to move into Nehemiah more closely. I've moved 23 times in my life, none bigger than my last back to America. Each time I move, I have to decide, either I keep what I have and I miss the trip, or I get rid of things and I go. And I think God is asking us to be willing to let go of things that are holding us back from experiencing this adventure, okay, in our Christian walk, which could lead to us leading many people to Christ and connecting. All right, so I think there's a lot of worthless junk in our life that God is asking us to get rid of, that's keeping us from coming closer, and that's keeping us from inheriting that spiritual inheritance that He is waiting for us. Let's move on to Nehemiah. Building a successful sports ministry according to Nehemiah. Now that we have a feel of what hinders us from experiencing revival in our own life and being willing to be a channel for revival in the lives of athletes and sports clubs. So there's 4 points here in building a successful sports ministry, and I'm going to go through these according to Nehemiah, and then I'm going to look at how ministry in Schillinggrid was impacted by this, okay? So vision, we can look at Nehemiah. Do you guys have your Bibles open? Nehemiah 1 through 9, action, stay the course, and expect results. So we're going to start with vision, okay? In Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3 and 4, it says this. It says, those who survived, if we look at what's happening here in Israel, basically 400 years before the birth of Christ, we're at that time frame in history, okay? And the nation of Israel and the Jewish people were in a desperate state of despair. Their nation had been destroyed, and the Babylonians had come to take over. Basically, God chose the Babylonians, who were also a sinful group of people, to basically take Israel into captivity because of Israel's sins. Okay, and so after 150 years after the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, is when the book of Nehemiah begins. So Nehemiah receives a calling from God to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and restore its security, its safety, its lawlessness, and its livelihood. And those were simple but divine steps that Nehemiah modeled when restoring the walls around Jerusalem, of which I followed, and we're going to look at here now. So that's a little background. So if we go into the 4 steps, the first step is vision. It begins with a burden, okay? So what burden did Nehemiah see when he saw the picture of Israel? We're just going to read chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Okay, so he felt a burden. He saw this city in despair, and he felt a burden for it. Then it goes on to say in Nehemiah verse 4 through 9. It goes on to say that I'll read it here really quickly. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that he is praying before you day and night for your servants. This is Nehemiah praying. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, we have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws that you and your servant Moses. And then it goes on to talk about Nehemiah's heart again. So through humility, through repentance, through dependency in Christ, through self-reflection, he wants to make sure that this is God's calling and not his own. He doesn't have any ego. It's not his agenda. It's not his ministry. He's not taking a name for it out of pride. It's God's. He wants to make sure it's God's call on his life. So he, on his knees in humility, prays and fasts over this, okay, to make sure his heart and his mind is pure before he goes forward. Then we go into action. In Nehemiah 2, 17 and 18, we see how Nehemiah communicates and spreads the vision among his people. So in verse 17 and 18, it says, Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. All right? So he's sharing the vision and uniting people to rally around this because there's power in numbers. Then he delegates responsibility in Nehemiah 3, 1 through 32. I'm not going to read it, but he brings all these different tribes into this picture because he knows, again, there's power in numbers. Just like you saw the movie Braveheart, William Wallace was trying to get the clans to conquer England for the sake of their own country. This is basically Nehemiah bringing tribes throughout the surrounding Jerusalem area to help make this project take place, okay? Then he looks at the best framework. And in 1 Corinthians 9:19, Paul talks about, I've been all things before all men in order to win someone for Christ. So the best framework in Sweden was not taking a parachurch, I'll get into that organization, but trying to be culturally correct and build a church-based sports ministry and do it through the local church. That's Jesus' bride and the way to lift up the church through sports ministry. So he seeks the best framework. Okay, and I do want to say, as a missionary for 20 years in Sweden, God will draw resources to a vision that's inspired by him. We barely survived for 20 years financially, but we've always survived. God gives us little enough to be dependent on him and enough to survive. And so that's pretty cool. The next point, you guys, that I want to share is to stay the course and be prepared for resistance. Because it's part of the job description. Resistance is part of the job description. In Nehemiah 2, verse 19, it says, But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah an Ammonite official, and Geshem an Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? And then Nehemiah stays the course, and with conviction he stands his ground, and he says, I answer them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. In other words, he will draw resources to this project, as I just shared. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So stand your course. When you're convicted by God, he will draw resources to your vision. Then Nehemiah stuck around to see the results. And I've seen a lot of people in Sweden that, a handful of, so many wonderful servants, but a couple of my colleagues that were so desperate to see fruit that it burnt them out waiting for that to happen. And they left ministry. They never were around long enough to see the fruit up close, almost like Moses not being allowed to come in the promised land. He couldn't see it up close. But stick around to see the fruit. In Nehemiah 6, verse 15 and 16. Okay. It shows about how he built up the walls and how it was so effective. So, we can read about that. But following up, expecting results. We should expect results when we're doing what God calls us to do. My coach used to say, expect to win. If you've done all the groundwork ahead of time, the results will come. Well, if we're doing God's will, we know that he will plant eternal seeds. Be prepared for follow-up through discipleship. Have patience. A lot of people we're reaching in the sports world, when they make a stance for Christianity, they're leaving their social groups, and it's a big step for them. Plan to disciple and baptize those we reach, and connecting them to local churches should be the goal of our ministry, okay? It's not a project, but a process. So looking at Schillingerid really quickly, the vision of Nehemiah, I saw 2% believers in Sweden. I felt a responsibility to give back to God for what he gave me through sports, people that mentored me. And I felt a heart for a compassion for these people. So we started on our knees with prayer and fast groups. We had prayer and fast for a week each year before our year started to parameterize this vision in God's through prayer. We saw in action, we saw leadership from the church and the hockey club get together and redo the whole hockey schedule to make it work for both the church and the sports club. We developed a prayer team, which became a supporter club and a cheering section, and it was our youth choir. We had outreach programs, we had hockey cafes, we had a hockey school, sport confirmation that led hundreds of people to Christ every year. And we did that through the local church, okay? We stayed the course. There was member resistance. There was people in the church in the very beginning that wouldn't even go to the games because they thought it was sinful, who later came and apologized for having that attitude. And the one guy, I'll remember, his name was Joseph, who condemned me the first day he saw me, my first day of work, told me he didn't support me being there, but came back 6 months later when his next-door neighbor became a Christian through our hockey games, through the evangelical program we had in our rank, and she started coming to church, and that's what spoke to him. And then he became involved in that Christian cheering section. There was church resistance, there was the media resistance through the years, and I could talk a lot about that, but There's really been one where a church tried to take advantage of a seminar that a church in America was doing to help seminars for homosexuality the church was offering for people that were struggling with it. And they saw that we were connected to the church at Southeast, who were doing a great job with these seminars. People were freely coming, and yet they saw that we were connected and tried to taint our ministry in Sweden, but God survived that. On the front pages of Aftonbladet and Expressen, the news, the sports pages and radios, they were trying to paint a picture of us being a judgmental ministry, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. So there was Decisions for Christ, financial growth, supported clubs, positive mass media exposure, and revival that took place in our town. And I have a 3-minute video I want to share before we go into the model in Indianapolis. But a couple articles. This is the hockey camp that broke the ice for sports ministry. 32 of 55 kids became Christians at our first hockey camp in Sweden. Our supporter club, our hockey rink, they were so grateful for the way we supported them, put a big sign in the rink, Jesus is security. They did it, we didn't do it, okay? I would stand up between periods and share my testimony during games, and then go in the locker rooms after the games and pass out Bibles and share my testimony in the locker room. They put a logo on our pants, Philadelphia Flyers support Schillingers Hockey Club. That was the Christian cheering section that raised money. So we had Jesus in the locker rooms, Jesus on the bleachers, Jesus in our pants. So in other words, our rink and our community became a missions field, which engaged people and led to revival. This is a guy named Dan who became a Christian in the ice rink. Okay, Dan became saved in the ice rink, it says here, with the Philadelphia Flyers sign right in the back. This is an article with the headlines that says, "Preaching direct from the ice and then the tie." I actually scored 3 goals that game to tie a game against our rival, Nässjö, right after I'd given a testimony on the ice. And the guy that wrote the article the next day, who wasn't a believer, wrote an amazing article showing their confidence in the work we were doing. 30 young boys received Christ at our second camp. These are guys praying on the ice during our hockey camps, okay? Chaplaincy programs we developed with Hammarby Hockey, where I was able to share ethics and morals, biblical principles in the sports world with professional hockey teams. Guys, I'm going to skip through these last slides really quick and conclude with a picture of what we're doing in our church in Indianapolis. Why is sports missions? Why is sports missions? It's biblical. Authors make parallels about it. It's a gift that God has given us. It's strategic. Many people are interested in sport. It's a universal language, and it's an important and integral part of our culture. It's critical to fulfill the Great Commission that Jesus shares in Matthew, to reach athletes where they are. They're a lost people group that need the Lord. It's possible. Don't feel it's not. You don't need to be an NBA player or a hockey player to find ways to reach people, okay? There are 2 positive resources in the community, and they're available for you as well. I can skip that right now. Traders Point Christian Church. Our church vision is to engage people with the love of God, inspire them to follow Jesus, and equip them to serve our world. If I had a model like this, I put together a little model from Nehemiah, not knowing what I was doing. It was the Holy Spirit that came in and did what God did by impacting a nation through sports ministry, where sports ministries are opening and churches are opening and new ground has been broken, okay? But the model that I've learned so much through our church is one of America's fastest growing churches. It's grown from about 1,400 people when I came there 4 years ago, and we're getting 5,000 people in attendance on weekends, close to that now. Over 300 people, I believe, have been baptized in the last 3 years or 4 years since I've been here. Per year. Biblically speaking, that's what the Bible would call a revival. We won't go into that, but then we have a sports ministry vision that I wrote, and it's transforming our community through faith and sport, one person at a time, seeing the one person that we've talked about here, okay? We have 5 strategic priorities in our church. Number 1 is to engage the unbelieving. Number 2 is to connect these people to smaller groups. And number 3, we have the priority to give a deeper knowledge of Christ And I can give these slides to you on paper, okay? Number 4 is to equip people for ministry to other people. And number 5 is to release people to serve others, okay? So basically what we have, guys, and I've made the sheet for you. You can take it and look at it. This is a list. Actually, you can pass it around. I did it a couple years ago. It's got to be updated. And this shows the 5 strategies that I just mentioned and the different programs that we offer. And basically, if you look at one program, for example, youth basketball, we engage people by inviting athletes in our community and even in our church to be a part of a program, okay? So if you look at youth basketball, we've got 430 kids that come every Saturday to play basketball games, but they practice during the week as well. So the next step would be to take these youth basketball players and connecting them to smaller groups. We have youth ministry in our church. We have what we call Kids Blast and Pulse and Catalyst. So we try to get these kids from youth basketball, when they're playing, into a smaller group on the court by giving devotions during the games. But then we also want to get them in groups outside of basketball in our church and get them integrated in our church. And that would be connecting them to small groups, number 2. Okay, number 3, give them a deeper knowledge of who Jesus is. We do through our devotions and through those kids' programs. Then we give them an opportunity. As they get older, our goal is to equip them to then go out and serve, which is our 5th priority, other people in the community. This past year, our youth basketball league baked cookies and took them to local fire stations. They wrote letters to the military. We had a bag hungry event where they filled, I think it was like 200 bags of food for poor people in the community. They baked, I think it was 2,000 cookies for poor people in the community as well, and for service people. They've written letters to military people and so forth. So this is a little diagram as how we invite people from the community to our church to engage them in the love of Christ through sports programs, get them into smaller groups, give them a deeper knowledge of who Christ is, equip them through the gospel to then release them to serve other people in the community. There is no, in our Sport for Life ministry was not this thorough with what we did either. God has led thousands of people to Christ through Sport for Life over the years. But I have a desire, and Dave has a desire, to make this model and go deeper with this available for the forum. For you pastors that come here that don't know how to reach out to the sports community, we would love to build a network and educate you on that on a yearly basis here at the forum or in some other way. And so that's a heart and a passion that we have through our church. So I'm going to end there, and we can open it up for questions.